All right, hello. This is a presentation / lecture about how to give a summary. Before I begin, a lot of the content in this presentation is adapted from another summary lecture that was posted on YouTube a long time ago. That video is extremely long and extremely in-depth. I would highly recommend anyone watching this to also check that video out. But my lecture will be much shorter, and I've changed just a few things based on personal experience and added a few things in. I'll try to link the other lecture in the video description. All right, first an overview about what we will be covering. First, just some misconceptions about the summary, and then background about models of debate. Second is the purpose of the summary, then executing the summary, then some specific preferences people have when it comes to giving the summary, then using language and spinning arguments to try to win more rounds, and then some concluding thoughts. All right. To clear a few things up, I think the biggest issue when people, especially newer debaters, approach the summary is that it's hard to tell what the summary is supposed to do. But once people realize what the summary is intended to accomplish, practicing it and improving at it becomes a lot easier. I think a good way to describe the summary is as a science rather than an art, because there's a basic formula that the summary follows, and if you can learn and follow that formula, you'll probably give a pretty good summary. Beyond that, you just need to practice, and giving more speeches, I think, is the best way to improve. Okay, let's get into some important background. This lecture will focus primarily on giving technical or flow summaries, and for that we will have to focus on the offense-defense model of debate, which is how I would say most flow judges evaluate rounds. In the offense-defense model, the arguments that you make are either offensive, which is a reason to vote for you, or defensive, which is a reason to not vote for the opposing team. And to win a round, you need offense. But on top of just winning a piece of offense, you need to make an argument about why your offense is more important than your opponent. And if you can do that, that's all you need to win. Something that's unintuitive but extremely helpful, I think, is the win by one model. And what this says is that you should try to win by the bare minimum. Because it only takes one offensive argument to win, in most cases, you should be only going for one offensive argument in the late stages of the round. Especially with the extremely short speech times in public forum, putting all your time into ensuring you win that one argument is generally more effective than splitting up your time among multiple arguments. All right, so now we've established a model for debate. Then the next question is, what does the summary have to accomplish under this model? It's three main things. First is pick the arguments to go for, then gain access to those arguments, and then finally make an argument about why your arguments are the most important, which is like some people call it weighing. This is the formula that you should be getting into your head when you give a summary, and what should govern your strategy generally in the second half of a round. Okay. Now I want to go through step by step for each task of the summary, starting with how to pick arguments. The most basic way to pick arguments is to choose the ones that are undercovered by your opponents, or in other words, easy to access, or ones that have big impacts, in other words, easy to weigh. While doing just these two things will work, a smarter move is to also consider how all of your arguments function within the context of the round. As in, does one argument function as defense against your opponent's arguments, or is one of your arguments a prerequisite? In other words, it's the same thing as is an argument easy to weigh, but it's more specific to the round you are debating. If you want to learn more about argument selection, the lecture I mentioned earlier, like at the beginning of this video, goes very in-depth and gives a drill that you can use to practice it. I think that prior to every tournament, you should be thinking about how your arguments interact with other potential arguments, and maybe even write out like some notes or some weighing or like some strategy, some like a strategy document or something like that. For defensive arguments, I think it's a lot simpler. Just pick responses that were either dropped by your opponents or mishandled. Efficiency is going to be the most important, so you just want to pick arguments that you can easily spit out. Okay, after picking arguments, you now have to gain access to them, which consists of two things: frontlining and extending. When you frontline an argument, you have to respond to all responsive responses. I say responsive because many times teams will read responses that only sound responsive. For example, if you have a piece of evidence that's an empiric that says the price of X product is cheaper than the price of Y, and your opponent responds by reading warrants about why X is very expensive, it should not matter unless your opponent's evidence specifically says that like X is more expensive than Y. That's because even if there are logical reasons why X is more expensive, if your empirical evidence concludes at the end of the day that X is less expensive or X is cheaper, that's all that matters. The other summary lecture that I mentioned also goes into this issue a bit more if you're still confused. All right, after frontlining, you now have to extend the argument, which is pretty straightforward. It's just re-explaining the argument. Usually judges will say, like, at the bare minimum, the link and the impact. Okay, final step is making arguments about which arguments are more important, and people like to call this weighing, but I think by just calling it weighing, it gives rise to people making like quote-unquote weighing arguments that aren't actually real weighing. Framing weighing as arguing about which arguments are more important forces you to be comparative. You can't argue that your offense is more important than your opponent's offense without actually addressing what your opponents are saying. And I think that all weighing should directly interact with the other team's arguments. So it should be like extremely comparative. You should be directly comparing what your argument is to what your opponent's argument is. And since there are already a ton of resources on like how to weigh and how to get better at weighing, I won't go into this much further. Brief note on defensive arguments. First is that defense is not necessary if you weigh. As long as you win offense and when that offense is the most important, you should be good. But if you do decide to extend defensive arguments, I would say all you need to do is either emphasize it if it's conceded or like explain why it still holds if your opponents contest it. All right, quick recap. The structure of the summary is picking arguments to go for, gaining access to those arguments, and then weighing. So that's the basic formula that you should be following. Okay, this next section of the lecture will go into some specific preferences that people might have when giving a summary. And first, I want to talk about extending. I think having pre-written extensions of arguments can be useful because then you can refine it and make it super efficient like prior to the tournament. But I know some people don't like reading off a computer or like reading off a computer, so this might not be for everyone. But I think that something everyone should do is practice extending an argument prior to their tournament, which means like saying what you would say in an actual speech, trying to figure out how to give like a smooth transition and clear up any stumbles you might have when extending. On frontlining, first, ideally you should have prepped front lines and like have a document full of them before the tournament. If not, I guess like you just have to think of them on the spot. When it comes to the actual frontlining, I think the most common way people do it is by saying they say we say, as in like they say there won't be a recession because unemployment is low, but we say there will be because blah blah blah. While this way is pretty easy to do, I think it's very inefficient because you don't need to re-explain all of your opponent's responses every time you want to frontline them. Instead, you can use what I call the keywords method, which is, for example, instead of what I said before, you could say low unemployment doesn't matter. Our evidence is looking holistic at the economy holistically. The word unemployment should be enough to signal to the judge where you are on the flow. So you don't need to re-explain the entire argument to signpost. If you can give a key word or a key phrase, that should be enough. This will probably make your frontlining a good chunk shorter and give you more time to like develop weighing arguments or like more thorough frontlining. I think that this method of frontlining is very hard, especially if you've been saying the they say we say for a long time. I would recommend practicing this keywords method in your like mock debates, practice debates, and in your redos to try to get the hang of it. The other summary lecture also discusses this method on frontlining if you want to hear more about it. Okay, quickly on extending and frontlining. My opinion is that the most efficient way to do it is to frontline and extend at the same time by going through each piece of relevant evidence and either extending it if it's conceded or frontlining it if it's contested, and then extending that single piece of evidence you just frontlined. I think this is a personal preference thing though, and some people prefer to frontline and extend separately. I will say though that you should be frontlining before you extend because it's easier to judge that way. Your judge probably flows responses like in a column and the responses will be right next to your case. So it makes more sense to frontline each response and then to extend it because that's the order your judge would flow it. They would first flow your front lines and then draw the arrow. They wouldn't draw the arrow first and then write the front lines. Okay, almost the last section. This is about how to win even when you shouldn't. First, I think that one of the most important and undervalued skills in debate is ballot directive language, which means like telling your judge what is important and what they should evaluate. For example, if your opponents drop weighing that you read, you could say they dropped the weighing, so our argument comes first. Or you could say something like the weighing is conceded. That means when evaluating the round, the first place you look to should be our contention too. While the extra words might seem silly, they're actually very useful because one, judges aren't perfect, they might not catch everything. So slowing down and using these extra words and emphasis increases the chance that you and the judge will be on the same page. But on top of that, ballot directive language can make you seem more perceptually dominant, which can give you the edge in like extremely close rounds. Basically, just remember that even flow judges aren't robots. Debate is still a communication event, so slowing down and emphasizing things that are important is always useful. Another thing that you could do to win, even when you shouldn't, is spinning your language in your arguments. Once again, this strategy works because flow judges aren't perfect. People talk fast and they don't write every single down. So let's say that you forgot to read a good response in rebuttal and you want to bring it up in summary. You shouldn't be able to do that, but if you're clever with your language, you can. One way you could do it is that you can frame the new response as weighing, but that's a pretty basic move and most judges will recognize it. Instead, you can say something like, you can extend your old response and then follow it up with something like what that means is, or the implication of that is, and then read a new response. This is not going to work every time, but I think if you're clever with it, you can weave in new implications that will be strategically significant and might help you win. All right, some closing thoughts. Just once again, I think the big thing to remember is that the summary, while it's hard, it's not complicated. It's based on that formula that we discussed before, and it's just a matter of practicing it. You know the formula, so you just need to try to practice it and get to know it more. Not every single round will follow this formula, but I think it's a solid place to start. All right, I hope everyone learned something new from this lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me.